Pam Bondi announced they were disbanding the unit that specifically is charged with ensuring foreign interference does not impact our elections. Yeah, that's real. Now there are fresh concerns regarding what happened in 2024 presidential election, specifically in Clark County, Nevada. A lot of people were concerned with what was happening there because they were shocked with the Republican turnout in Clark County. They said, hey, significant number of union workers there. It has always been a Democratic stronghold. Now a nonpartisan group called the Election Truth Alliance, or ETA, has wrapped up their independent investigation of voting data from Clark County. They found some unusual patterns that they say could point to, quote, potential vote manipulation. Nathan Taylor, the executive director of the Election Truth Alliance, he joins us right now. So Nathan, just explain to us how y'all define this potential vote manipulation. What did y'all see in terms of these numbers?
Thank you so much for having me. So in terms of what we were looking at in Clark County, Nevada, they published just after the election their vote record, their cast vote record, and that goes down to the tabulation machines and the three types of voting. So mail-in, early vote, and election day. And so what we did is we looked at the statistical distribution of that data, and we compared those three types. And we saw that mail-in, it looks statistically normal distribution, a bell curve pattern. We saw that election day didn't look very anomalous at first, but then we looked at early voting. And early voting is where a majority of the votes were cast during the election for Clark County, Nevada. And when we looked at it, we actually pulled out the distribution, and we saw it shows statistical evidence of potential manipulation. And what that means is a portion of both candidates' votes look like they could have been changed. And we see that because instead of a bell curve, it comes out more of a Russian tail, as we would call it. And so we delved deeper, and we actually pulled data for Washoe County, Nevada. That's the second most populous location. And a little bit about my background. I work in cybersecurity. I was a 25 Bravo computer tech specialist in the Army Reserves, got my degree in network security, and then commissioned at the Army National Guard. And so I worked data, analysis for my normal job before kind of stepping into this role and helping found and run the Election Truth Alliance. And so what was concerning about this election and led us to looking into the actual data was, as you mentioned, 7 swing states kind of popped up after the election, and we thought that was strange, given some of the polls, given some of the other analysis. And when we dove deeper, now we're seeing the potential for the vote counting machines to have been manipulated. And so the main concern is the type of manipulation we're seeing in Clark County, Nevada. It's not unique to Clark County, Nevada. We've done analysis on other locations. We're looking at Pennsylvania right now. We were looking at Wisconsin. We were looking at Florida. We were looking at Texas and California. And so many of these higher population centers in these states exhibit the same indications at a higher level. And that's a drop-off vote abnormality, where, for example, one party at the presidential level, they get a certain amount of votes. And then you look at the next down ballot for their party, like the senator or the governor or the superintendent, and you find that those lower positions have more votes than the president. And that's very concerning. And that ultimately also led to us diving a little deeper. So we did provide some graphics, but I don't really think we need the graphics just to kind of talk about some of the potential.
Well, that's why a lot of people were asking. They were like, "Wait a minute, hold up. How did he win? How did Trump win all of the battleground states, but the only 2 places the Republican candidate won in the Senate was Ohio and Pennsylvania? They lost in Wisconsin, they lost in Michigan, they lost in Nevada, they lost in Arizona." And there was no Senate race on the ballot in North Carolina and in Georgia. And in fact, when you look at North Carolina, Democrats won governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and secretary of state.
So what is interesting as well is when people talk about candidate Harris at the time and how she performed, right? Talking about popularity and saying, oh, well, people didn't vote for her. She wasn't popular. People were switching their votes at the presidential level and then voting Democrat all the way down. Well, I looked at this as well, and we pulled some of the data for both all the swing states in this election and last election. And we said, how many votes did Harris get in comparison to Biden in those 7 swing states?
And correct me if I'm wrong, this is the graphic you were referencing, right? Swing versus non.
This one, yes. This is a drop-off vote analysis, and this was actually made by Smart Elections, which is another organization that does election integrity and analysis.
Go ahead.
So they published this, and what this is showing is this is some of the swing states versus non-swing states, and it looks very suspect that Harris would underperform consistently across just the swing states, and then outside the swing states, she's almost 1 to 2%, like Trump is.
For instance, in this first graphic right here, it shows that in the swing states, it shows red 752, blue negative 189. Yet in non-swing states, it shows red 464 and blue 351. That's just a 103,000 vote difference compared to a nearly 900,000 vote difference. And then when we go over to this graphic right here, this is the percentage. So you see an increase. So the way
you read this, if I may.
Go ahead.
Is the 0% is the next down ballot candidate. So in this case, I believe this is senators. So 0% is how many votes that party's senator or whatnot got. So we see in the swing states, Harris got negative 1.48% less votes than the senator across and on average across all 7 swing states. And then Trump got almost 6% more than that senator or that next down ballot candidate. And then outside the swing states, all the other states, we're seeing it look more normal and matching past election trends where you're somewhere between 1 to 2% over the Senate, over the senator or the governor or whatever other races there are. So that's how you read this. That's why it's concerning.
So you're saying that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is that if Harris was just so unpopular, then what you would see in swing and non-swing states would be a decrease or people staying at home and not supporting her. But you're saying, wait a minute, how the hell do you see a plus percentage in non-swing states, but then you see this big negative, as if outside of the 7 battleground states, it was like, yay, we're cool with Harris, but those specific 7 battleground states were like, yeah, we ain't down with her.
I think you highlighted exactly the concern. Why would just the swing states exhibit a pattern? And so that's a huge red flag, because what wins you elections? It's the swing states. And so I actually did the numbers for how Harris compared to Biden from the 2024 election, how many votes she got across all 7 swing states versus what Biden got in 2020. And we find that in 24, Harris exceeded Biden in Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Georgia. I believe those numbers are up to date.
Guys, if we have that graphic, control and pull it up. Go ahead.
I don't believe you have that graphic.
Okay.
And I'll quote some more graphics that I know you do have here in a moment. But This is a good number for you just to kind of show you how the theory that she's unpopular and that's why she would be underperforming doesn't add up. And that's that she got 99.6% of all the votes cast in 2020, the Democratic votes that turned up in 2020 for those 7 swing states. She got 99.6% of them in 24. So it doesn't make sense that she would be underperforming by a large amount in these states, but then get 99.6% of the same votes.
So with that, you believe that something was done to the voting machines? Do you believe that, like, for instance, I've heard people, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and when people, I'm very skeptical when people throw it. I've heard people say, hey, wait a minute. People were using Starlink to transmit the data, the voting data from precincts to the state elections board. And that Starlink, of course, owned by Elon Musk. Of course, Joe Rogan made this famous phrase that Elon Musk created this app that an hour after the polls closed showed, oh, Trump is going to win. I'm going to sleep. And he was like, man, how did he know? And then, of course, Trump, leading up to the election, was like, hey, don't worry about it. We don't need your votes. We got this. So people are pointing to those things as evidence that something was amiss. So are you saying that you believe that the voting numbers were somehow changed either in the machines or in the transmission to the state elections board?
If we bring up slide 5 here, that's the one that's showing Clark County election day voting. And so
is that it right here?
Distribution. Yep,
okay.
That's exactly it. This is what I was talking about a little earlier, where when we look at the vote record Clark County gave us and published after the election, this is more what you would expect to see when looking at that data. And so there's two different colors. One is red and one is blue. Obviously, the blue is the Democrats for presidential race, which would be Harris, and the red is Trump. And so they are overlapped. But when you pull both of them out, they should look like a bell curve. And in this case, for election day, they look pretty much like a bell curve. You're not seeing any huge issues.
Is this right here the bell curve? This one right here? This what you're talking about?
That is I don't believe we referenced the bell curve, but that line,
right.
No, this is an excellent slide. If you look at the line, and this is us pulling early voting out, the black line is what you would expect to see as a bell curve.
Okay.
So that line there that's overlaid on top of the voting data,
right,
that is what you would more expect to see. Okay. Now, if you go back to slide 4, I'll actually show you exactly what we were seeing and talk about what would potentially cause this. So comparing this to election day, you notice this does not look the same. It's not a more rounded bell curve, a more random and expected distribution. And so what we're seeing, this is Clark County in 24 at the bottom for early voting and 2020 at the top. And you'll notice.
Wow.
Let's look at 2020 first. So if you zoom in just a little bit, the way you read this graph is the x-axis, the bottom axis, that is how many votes the machine counted. And so each of these little dots, there's a red and a blue, and each of them are a machine that counted the votes where you voted. And so in this case, there's a ridiculous amount of votes for early voting. And we see that those tabulators or those voting machines, in this case, they have, in Clark County, Nevada, they have like polling centers they set up. So you can generally go anywhere. And so what we see is as the amount of votes were cast, the places where there were more votes cast, we see after about, I think for early voting, it's closer to 500-600 votes or so.
So we're going to do this here. We're actually going to switch from my control room to my iPad.
There we go.
So this is okay. So now I'm able to zoom
Perfect.
in. Okay, so this is the top one, and this is the bottom one. Okay, go ahead.
Yes. So let's look at the top first, and x-axis is how many votes the machine counted. Each of these is a different machine. Some machines only counted a handful of votes. Some counted 800 plus. And so the left, the y-axis is the percentage of votes. So the higher up you go, the closer, the further up and the closer you get to 100%, you win more votes. And so what we saw when we pulled this data and we did this analysis, in 2020, up until about 450 to 500 votes counted by machine or cast at the machines, it looks normal.
Right. So that's that.
500.
Go ahead. Okay. Then 500, all of a sudden, we see a lot of red above 55%.
Right. We see separation.
Okay.
And so what's interesting is if you kind of break this down into the correlation or the trend, as more votes were cast at higher populations, the Republican Party benefited. And so what was weird about this is in 2020. What was weird about this is counterintuitive to how voting patterns normally are. Well, one, you don't generally see a trend as more votes are cast. You just see a better reflection of how people, generally feel.
Okay.
And the problem is Democrats generally benefit at high populations because they live in high populated areas. So this makes very little sense for either of those reasons.
So this is 2024 right here. above.
This is 2020 at the top.
Yeah, at the top. This is 2020 that we're seeing right here. And
This is 2020. This is 24.
And this is 24. Wow.
And so if you use the same concept, we see about from 250 to 300 onwards, that normal distribution just disappears, right? And you see you see aggressive separation.
Right. So this is normal right here. As you say, this is normal.
The first part is.
This is normal. Then all of a sudden you see these gaps.
Yes. And so you're not supposed to see separation like this. And when we pull out the distribution, the slide we were looking at before, you can go, I think, two slides or so, you had the bell curve slide. And I'll show you exactly why this is concerning and what this potentially means. So there's a slide with both Harris and Trump, and they have a bell curve overlaid. It's a red and a blue graph. And that's actually that distribution we were just talking about for early voting, but in a different way to analyze it.
All right.
And so what we see,
let me find that.
Is when we look, instead of the normal bell curve for early voting, we see.
Is this it right here? I want to make sure is this it?
This is election day. And this is great. So This is your other way of looking at it. Notice election day generally fits the bell curve pattern, right?
Right.
Yeah. There's a little bit of weirdness at the top.
Right.
And I can say we looked at Washoe County, which was the other county in Clark County, Nevada, and we do see the same issue, more aggressive for election day there and in 2020. So what we're thinking potentially happened, if you go to the next distribution slide and we look at early voting, but for this type of graph.
This here?
Here, perfect. So this, as I said, when you look at this statistically, and in the Election Truth Alliance, we have people with experience in statistics, data analysis. We have people with medical and engineer degrees. We have a little bit of everything. And so what we've done is we said, instead of this matching a normal distribution like you would expect to see, it shows potential manipulation. And what's concerning is, if we look at the top one, there's a concept here where if you want to win an election, or in this case, for voting data and distribution, the further right a majority of your votes are, after the 50% mark, you win. That's how you win in this case. And so what we're seeing, specifically in early voting, because it's so aggressive, we're seeing that a portion of the distribution is missing. And so this suggests, since in this case, this is candidate Trump, it suggests that his distribution shows that he's benefiting from potential manipulation. That votes, if you look at the bottom, Harris is missing a portion of hers, and since she's at a lower percentage, we see that skew. And so the way this could indicate is it has a rightward skew, and Trump has a leftward skew. And a leftward skew, or another term, is a Russian tail. And so a Russian tail is a term coined by Russian data scientists and data analysts in reference to a few different potentially manipulated Russian elections. And so they coined the term of a leftward skew, like if you go up, and I believe we also have a reference in this document, but it's if you benefit from potentially moving votes around, you're going to have this leftward skew like we're seeing in Clark County, Nevada for early voting.
Now, what's interesting here, when you, I remember, so John Ralston is considered like the preeminent journalist when looking at data. And I remember every day he was tweeting and was shocked at the Republican numbers. And it was like, Democrats are in trouble in Clark County. And it was like, they're down. And people were like, oh my, I remember there was some culinary worker who had made a comment about, we're in some serious trouble. And a lot of people, they were just shocked and stunned at the early voting numbers that were coming back that was giving this indication that Republicans were just going crazy voting in Nevada.
So what's interesting is when people talk about election night, there's an expected pattern you see as votes come in because of time zones. And so Smart Elections actually recently posted a video on their YouTube, and it was referencing someone talking about what you would expect to see on election night. And so generally, like the Northeast, as their polls close, they're more Democrat. So you would see a little bit of a blue lead, and then Florida would come in and it would go red, and then you would get the middle Rust Belt areas, and it would go a little deeper red, and then the West Coast would come in last, and then you'd see that blue wave resurface, right? And so you'd see a little bit of a red mirage, is what it is. What's interesting is this election night, you didn't see that, and what you saw is after the first bit of votes came in, it stayed very positive for the Republicans, and it only grew. You didn't see a bounce back. You didn't see a resurgence. And so some people would quote that to see it almost looked algorithmic in the way the votes slowly crept up. And what's concerning is, as you mentioned before, how could you have done this if you could have done this? So I get this a lot, especially with my background. People talk about, our election is secure. Our election isn't hackable. We spent 4 years arguing, everything's good. And so what's funny is when you actually look at our election systems, it's not that our election systems are secure or they're not. It's that every state runs their own election. We have a few different types of machines, and we have paper trails. And that's how we should be securing our elections. The problem is, let's actually look at how every state runs their elections. All of them have different procedures. There's no standard guideline for how you should do it.
Right.
But even then, they still have checks and balances they take account. The problem is we only really use, for our tabulation machines and our voting machines, we only really have two main brands. And both of them, as we found in the last little bit of our analysis, both of them, I think 70% of the vote counting machines used in the country for elections have had issues of cybersecurity specialists mentioning potential vulnerabilities. And so first of all, if you were to manipulate our machines...
First of all, what are those two? You said there are two. Who are they?
I can't say the name of the brands myself.
Okay.
But the top two that you're going to, see, they should be pretty apparent. And as you mentioned, as you asked before, how would you do this? Well, you would, as you said, I think you would do it at the tabulation level. So some states, they have voting machines and then they transfer their votes, or they scan in paper ballots. And the tabulators are what's doing all that work. And so, as I said, there's two main brands. And if you were to compromise those tabulators, you could change the outcome of an election because you could just change votes. And it's that simple. Or you could change the data in transit from the tabulators. Either way would look the same on paper.
Okay.
Any questions or input on that?
So I'm going to go to my panel in a minute with questions. All right. So when you hear Republicans say we need to get away from these machines and go to paper ballots, what do you say?
I don't disagree that paper ballots or a paper trail is good. The problem is we actually have to use them. This election, I think there were 3 substantial audits that I looked at, Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And all 3 of those audits, in my opinion, were not effective in doing what they needed to do, which was to validate the presidential race. Pennsylvania conducted I believe it was a risk limiting audit for maybe 2%, and they did the Treasury, and they didn't even poll an appropriate amount of Philadelphia, which is like over 10% of their voting population. So it's things like that where if you don't set standards for what would actually catch manipulation, like we're saying potentially happened, and we're seeing indication of with the statistical evidence. And as I said, we're working on Pennsylvania and doing a statistical analysis like this, and I recently posted a video where we're seeing the same trend of as more votes are counted, the Republicans start to lead as if a change was occurring in Philadelphia and in Erie County. And so I think the problem is if you spent 4 years discrediting election integrity, because that's the difference. This is an election denial. This is election integrity. Right. It's not that we want to question the results. We want to validate that our machines are accurate. And that's why you should do audits. It's not about anything else. And so these audits were not efficient. These audits did not pass the standards, and they didn't even appropriately audit the races that could have been manipulated. And so to hold up, and Georgia and Arizona, they had their own different forms of audits, risk limiting audits, I believe. And I actually looked at those, and other data analysts and statisticians looked at them and said, hey, this isn't matching up either. There's some concerns of, these numbers don't really show. There was some errors in the reporting, and some previously reported numbers didn't match some in numbers, among other things. And so realistically, the way you should deal with our system is you use the machines. The machines are good. And then you immediately conduct audits at any point, and you appropriately sample the population, and you look at the presidential race. You can look at other races too, and you would pretty much quickly see concern. The problem is our system wants recounts. And so if you don't meet a threshold to do a recount automatically, and the candidate doesn't ask for one, it doesn't get done. It doesn't get checked. And so that's the issue we ran into this election.
Questions from the panel. Scott, you first.
Yeah, maybe. I listened to your data. I'm a former state party chair. I've run at least 4 local or presidential elections from the nation's capital, at least on the Democratic side. You'd have to agree that there are other variables that would counter your at least preliminary conclusions. For example, maybe the Republicans, those low propensity voters that the Republicans went after in order to outvote the Dems, outvoted the Dems and came out in huge numbers. And that was the differential, and that made the difference in the swing states and elsewhere. That simple piece alone would counter what you say is algorithmic oddity.
Manipulation.
Manipulation, forgive me.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah. Tell me your answer to that.
Point, right, is if turnout was effective. I don't know if you have the slides to reference this, but we actually mapped the early voting in Clark County to Las Vegas, and we looked at where these polling centers were and the turnout and how each party performed at these polling locations.
Is it a graph or is it a? I'm trying to.
It is a map, very simple map with some overlay. It may have been included. If it is, it's an excellent point. If it isn't, I can talk through it.
All right, I'm trying to look for it, but go ahead.
Okay. But what we did, as I said, is Clark County, Nevada specifically, they don't poll or they don't vote by precinct. You can go pretty much anywhere to one of these polling centers, early voting or election day, and they'll map your vote back, and it gets added up. And what we found, as you mentioned, right, is if the Republicans turned out in huge numbers, well, there's 2 trends that are strange. One is, generally, as you said, the rural areas, those are where you're going to see those Republicans really turn out. You can still see them in some of the more populated areas.
Is this it here?
Good.
Hold up. Is it the one that says Clark County binning by votes?
Early voting map?
That's not it, right?
This is another example of what we're seeing, but.
Okay, keep talking. Keep talking through, and I'll try to find that map. Go ahead.
No worries if you can't find it. But to answer your question very distinctly, we mapped those locations for early voting. We mapped the machines and the amount of votes those machines got. And Clark County specifically is a very liberal, very left-leaning location. And Las Vegas, specifically the actual
let's
city
see.
area,
is this it right here? Nathan, is this it right here? Is this it?
No, sir. It's fine.
Okay.
I'll talk through a little bit.
Okay, all right.
We may not have provided it for you. I think it's 3 different things.
Okay, go ahead.
Actually, this map there, as you saw, is highlighting the 2 different highly populated areas. It's Washoe and it's Clark County.
This one here?
And so, yep. And so at the bottom is Clark County, Nevada. It is the #1 location in terms of population.
Right.
It's very liberal. And so the city of Las Vegas, we mapped it out location by location, and we compared the voting demographic, the registered voters in those areas. We looked at people are registered by precinct, but they don't vote by precinct. So we looked at those precincts. We looked at what the percentage of Democrat to Republican is, and it is heavily in Democrat favor. It's nonpartisan and Democratic in Las Vegas, and yet we're seeing polling locations that the Republicans were leading by over 5,000 votes in some cases. And so it's strange to see that there is no heavy red stronghold in the middle of Las Vegas, but we're seeing the early voting polling locations show that when we look at the data. And so
but you yourself said,
concerns us.
You yourself said that in the state of Nevada that they don't vote by precinct. You can go anywhere and vote. And it's possible that red voters or GOP voters went to urban centers in Nevada or high Democratic output and voted. I listen, I think your analysis is valuable. I do. And it's interesting. I guess what begs the question is, if everything you say is right regarding the algorithms and stuff, and you say this is how it could happen, voter manipulation, then what's next? What do you do with this data? How does it work for us? How does it help us? And how does it might maybe in the future fix kind of what the issues are you're raising?
Yeah, excellent point. The reason why we want to kind of bring this to light and we want these questions is we want audits. It's never too late to conduct a audit or an investigation.
Yeah.
Obviously, the election is certified. The election is over. That's perfectly fine. But there is far more benefit in conducting audits and looking at the paper ballots and comparing them to the results, not just in Clark County, but in any of the swing states and even in other states. And so, as I said before, we want to validate the election. That's what my job has been since election night, is we want to make sure that our machines are safe. We want to make sure that people are asking these questions because it benefits everyone that we validate. And it doesn't hurt anyone. And we do an audit, right? We go to Nevada, we go to Clark County, we say, hey, let's audit let's audit all three types. And we find no discrepancies and no issues. The paper trail matches the reported votes. That's perfect. And we hold that up and we say, our elections are free and fair. This was just a discrepancy. And we can figure out why that is. As you said, maybe this was a historic moment and there was a lot of momentum and people came out to vote in unique ways. But realistically, unless you validate and you check, it hurts us all. And so that's why we want accountability and we want audits. And we are willing to pay for them as well. I've reached out to a couple different organizations and entities to help us, push for those.
Mustafa?
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing this information. My dad was big into mathematics, probability, statistics. So this is helpful. I'm curious. We've got this dismantling of the election security efforts that are going on right now. How does that impede the work that you're doing? I mean, see what's going on with the FBI and the task force that's there, the DOJ, FEC, EAC, all these different folks are supposed to play a role. As we move toward midterms, of course, we've got to get this right, make sure that there's, no funny business, I'll say it that way. So I'm just curious about the steps you think we should take and how, these changes that we're seeing inside the federal government might play a role.
It's very concerning to see the dismantling of these organizations that should be safeguarding our elections. That is a concern because what benefit is there to destabilizing our election systems, if not to make it easier to manipulate them? That is a concern. And I think, as you said, kind of going forward, this is why I helped found the Election Truth Alliance. It's because no one else was doing this work. No one else was actually looking into the numbers, holding up the data and saying, this looks weird, we should dig deeper. And that should have been the federal government. That should have been these agencies, but they've not been doing it even before they were being dismantled. And that's a concern as well. And so kind of going forward, as I said, we honestly just need to demand audits for both our local and state election officials. They can do it. They have the power. Your attorney generals and your secretaries of state, they could do an audit, and it, as I said, just be safeguarding. If for some reason we do audits and we do find discrepancies, that brings to light a lot of concerns, and it brings up the issue. And people ask me, why should we care about this now? All right, the election's over. Why should we care? And the problem is, if we don't validate this, and there was manipulation to the extent that we say could have potentially happened, that the data is indicating, that means there is no midterms. There is no next time. There is no, election 2016, because if you can manipulate an election, you choose the winner. And, there's no coming back from that. He who counts the vote wins.
Thank you.
Randy?
I really appreciate the work you've done because all Americans need to feel secure in our voting system. I was really interested when I was reading your report about the drop-off voting, where, most people, I think about, human behavior, we vote down the ticket. If you vote for a Democrat, the Democratic candidate for the presidential election, typically that's what you're going to vote for in the Senate. But from what you're saying, your report says there was a huge disparity this year, up to in some counties like 10%. What is normal? Like, what do we normally see when it comes to drop-offs?
So what's interesting is most people think the Republican Party is very straight ticket. That's actually, from our data, that's not truly correct. The Democrats are very straight ticket. They will vote all the way down ballot. There's very little budging for them. And so that was another weirdness with this election, to see potentially hundreds of thousands of people. I think the final numbers I was looking at was somewhere around 1.5 million votes. And you're telling me 1.5 million people split vote and voted all the way blue down ballot, but then voted, a different party at the presidential level. And so generally, percentage-wise, on average, it does depend on states. Some states, swing states, can be more chaotic. But as I said, you're going to see somewhere between a 1% to 2% overperformance for the president is normal. There's some historic, above performances, but generally you don't see the president underperforming, a senator or another position, because presidential races are a big deal. And so I had some numbers. We've been looking at different states and looking at drop off. And so one that people don't even realize, we were looking at some of the non-swing states, and we were seeing Harris got negative 19% of the votes that the senator did there. And just some other crazy numbers, like Texas as well. She was under 4%. And my concern is, and the reason why we're concerned, that if there was a way to manipulate the votes, people don't realize how big of a deal it could be. And that's because, let's say I take one vote. Let's say we both have one vote. And so I take your vote and I give it to myself. I've not taken one vote. I'm 2 votes ahead now. And so you're almost doubling the impact. And so I did the numbers in terms of how many votes, if there was a algorithm that was taking votes from one candidate at the presidential level and giving them to the other in the 7 swing states. I did the math for 6 that I could do using the drop-off vote analysis. And I said, all right, let's say Trump is around a 2% overperformance across most states on average. So let's take all the votes that he gets in excess of 2%, and let's do that reverse calculation. And so I found, as I said, 1.5 million votes is what that would have been potentially. And when we take those votes per state and we do the inverse and we give them back to, let's say, the Democratic Party, as I said, you're doubling the impact. And we see that in 6 swing states that I did the numbers for and looking at the drop-off vote, if that was caused by algorithmic manipulation, Harris leads in those 6 swing states when you do the inverse there. Also, that's not including any concerns about mail-in ballots never being delivered. That's not any concerns about voter suppression, which I do believe was a big deal in this election. I've spoken to Greg Palast, and he's really highlighting those concerns, and those are very critical.
Yeah, we had him on the show.
Yep. Yeah. So that's hopefully I answered your questions there, and that was the big concern.
So last question from me. Have you made a request to the Nevada Secretary of State, to the Nevada Attorney General, Aaron Ford, to do something?
I have had people within my organization draft and send out emails and correspondence reaching out to them. Yes, not just Nevada, but other states as well, other secretaries of state. I mean, we will continue to do so. And we have that PDF that you saw, and we have some other documentation. We send them saying, hey, here's our concerns, here's our analysis. We'd be interested in facilitating an audit. For Clark County, Nevada specifically, they have poll tapes. And so it's not a paper ballot trail, but you can still go in and look at the vote count. And if there was algorithmic manipulation, like we're saying, if the tabulation machines across the country could have been manipulated, what you would find when you compare it to the paper trail is you would find 2 things. I didn't talk about this a lot when we did it, but we were also seeing not only the potential for votes to have been changed from one candidate to the other, causing one candidate to underperform and the other candidate to exceed and overperform, which is what we're seeing in multiple swing states. But we're also seeing indication that for whatever reason, the Democratic Party in Clark County, Nevada, for early voting specifically, gets capped out, and it looks like votes could also have been deleted. So you would change votes until you're at a 60% margin for one party, and then you would just start deleting extra votes. And we're seeing indication of that too. So if we look at the paper trail in Clark County, Nevada, or in any other place this could have happened, potentially happened, you'll find that not only are there more votes on the paper trail and more paper ballots than were reported, but there would be missing votes for the Democrats that show up for the Republican Party.
All right. Nathan Taylor, we certainly appreciate this breakdown. Thank you so very much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. And right now we're accepting investors in our $17 million round to revolutionize the future of social media. Today, for just $399, you can own 60 shares of stock in Fanbase at $665 a share. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest today. While the big platforms have grown too massive and disconnected from their users, Fanbase is building a platform where creators and users truly come first. We've already raised $4.8 million from everyday investors who believe in this vision, and now you can join them. This is your chance to invest in a social media tech company with over 1 million users that is disrupting media by allowing anyone to reach all of their following and monetize their content from day one. The market is changing, big platforms are failing to serve their users, and Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now. Invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the future of social media.